chapter 3, whereby I talk about the political economy of debt in Africa. Now I'm talking about it as a cultural thing, whereby debt itself has been part of our economic landscape. And while it's, it's feasible to blame the outside world, many of our leaders also play a part in this,
Yeah.
I can show this in the case of Ghana, South Africa, Ethiopia, and many other countries, whereby they did play a part in ensuring that Africa has accumulated so much that they can't service at this level, right? And as I was doing this chapter, I then realized that before 2020, many African economies were bound to default, actually. So COVID-19 was much of an instigator, but sooner or later, without the pandemic or not, many African economies would have defaulted because they have a number of political, economic, governance challenges that are embedded in their politics. They'll always resurface as new challenges, but that have existed for a very long time. They're just named differently. And they always have some level of impact on the economy because it's very hard to separate the economy from the political system of the country, right? The economy is quite sensitive. It's a very sensitive sector, right? Very, very sensitive. The moment something happens, you'll notice in the currency devaluation or volatility within the currency, you will then get to understand that, oh, there's politics that's happening for the day, right? So that was the political economy that's chapter 3, whereby I wanted to understand the political economy of debt in Africa. And what I found out was that African states were bound to default, right? Because of how we manage many of our economies. But it's a very entrenched challenge whereby we did not emancipate our economies during independence, right? And then we now come to the case studies, each one of them, right? Whereby you have the South African case. Now, this was our first time in 2020 taking out a loan, borrowing from the IMF. And while South Africa has borrowed from a number of lenders before, right? But the IMF itself, it's the type of conditionalities that come with the loan, which have, to a certain extent, can compromise your sovereignty. That's what I was mostly concerned with, right? Conditionalities that might see some of the state expenditure not going where they're supposed to go, right? We remember structural adjustment programs. They had such a great impact on African economies, right? Because we have this tendency of exporting solutions in West African states. We export solutions. And that is a challenge because if you're going to export a solution, it's not an African solution. Therefore, it will not solve an African challenge. So it was our first time borrowing the money. But what I found out within the South African case study itself is the fact that debt, it's beautiful, right? According to a Keynesian economist. But debt is only beautiful if you're going to use it in a manner that will generate more money, right? If you're going to have this business approach towards it, whereby you're going to generate much profit as you can, because remember, the debt that you take or a loan that you take, the servicing costs and the debt itself, coupled with the interest, tends to be higher than the money that you took. So the idea is if you're going to borrow debt, and I can show this in the case of Ethiopia, if you're going to borrow debt, right, if you're going to take out a loan with the IMF or any international financial reserves, you have to ensure that you plow it back into an economy in a manner that will ensure that that economic sector will actually have more revenue than the debt itself. It becomes a challenge if I'm going to borrow 70,000 rands, whereas the sector in which I'm going to plow the debt is going to produce 40,000 in profit. It means that I do not have the means, right, or the ability to service the debt that I took. So that is the idea. And what you find in the case of South Africa is when the money was supposed to be, directed towards ensuring that we circumvent the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had corruption. Corruption was raging around that time, whereby we had a number of tenders, that actually in which the money was wasted in many of those tenders, which will not generate any form of revenue that we will need in future in order for us to service this debt. But also, South Africa also had some of its domestic challenges, such as your Eskom load shedding around that time when I was writing the book, which has gotten better now, which is a good thing. We're so thankful. Load shedding being one of them, but also we also had something that we call the 2021 riots, right? In which those were deadly riots, which were never seen since 1994, when when apartheid was being abolished in the country. So what you find is, and those riots cost the economy about 15 billion rands, right, of vandalism. So much of that whereby there was this social discontent, you have an energy crisis, you have corruption, but you also have the financial watchdogs grey listing us for financial misconduct, right, in terms of money laundering. So those are some of the challenges that are coupled together, which might then decrease the business climate. They affect the business climate whereby it really erodes the investor confidence in people who might want to invest, therefore decreased financial foreign direct investment, therefore the economy itself and businesses. If businesses are flying out of South Africa, it means that you have less revenue generating, right? So what I came to conclude in the case of South Africa is that, well, our politics has some certain influence in that, but also the economy, because the rand was all the time fluctuating. It was actually, reacting to the political challenges that we might have at that time. So if the politics are good, then the rand is good. But if the politics are bad, but the rand also it becomes in a very unpleasant state. So within the South African case, I would make conclusion that it's either we're going to end up in a debt trap, right, or a debt spiral, or over taxation, right? So in a debt trap, it's whereby we are trapped with debt, right? We are trapped as much as we can, whereby we're trying to service this debt, meaning that a debt that we're supposed to service in 5 years, we're most likely going to service it in 15 years, right? And then you have a debt spiral whereby you take a debt in order for you to emancipate yourself from another debt, right? So you're borrowing from the World Bank in order for you to pay the IMF, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you do not have debt anymore. It means that you have to solicit more funds in order for you to service the World Bank debt, right? So now it means that we end up having a lot of debts in which they're spiraling throughout the economy, right? And the GDP is not also doing so good, right? But what's nice about the South African economy is the fact that it's robust enough, right? Whereby debt can be pronounced as a crisis rather than a cancer, a cancerous challenge whereby it's embedded. So we're hoping that we can actually get to a point whereby we are done paying some of our IMF and World Bank debts that we took. And also the case of overtaxation, and now this goes back to the theory of Marx on public debt, whereby he says that, yes, it's a good thing to take out debt, right? Or whereby you can borrow from, financial monetary institutions. But you should notice that the people who are going to pay the debt, those are your citizens, right? You'll start to have overtaxations. Everything will be super expensive, everything. Now, everything is taxed, even the staplest foods, such as maize meal. That's not supposed to be taxed, but it has VAT in it. And I can show an example this year whereby I can allude that, yes, indeed, what we are seeing in the case of South Africa, it is the overtaxation and lower standards of living within the South African case in order for us to service this debt. And while we know that some of the government policies, some can be implicit, but some explicit, right? Mm-hmm. And I feel like these are one of the implicit ones, whereby earlier this year, within the GNU, there was a motion in which we wanted to, or the government wanted to increase VAT, right? I think to 5.5. And this motion was never tabled, right? It went back and forth in which there were discrepancies, disagreements, rebukes in which some of the political parties that are part of the GNU would reject this to say that, no, you are going to worsen the standard of living for South Africans because it's quite for the citizens in the country, because it becomes quite unbearable because everything is already expensive. Fuel is expensive. Now we have to think, if we're going to have VAT increased, it means that transport fares, everything is increased. But what I could solicit from that whole event, or from that whole thing that was happening, right? The discrepancies that were happening, the back and forth, is the fact that South Africa needed revenue in order for them to service the debts that they took. So that's where it comes with overtaxation of citizens. And one way or another, they are going to overtax somewhere in order for them to solicit these funds, whether it's road servicing, taxing, anything, but they are going to find ways in which they are going to overtax citizens in order for them to pay this debt, because they do understand the implications of the implications of losing your sovereignty in light of not being able to service a debt or defaulting.